film, I'm going to be talking to you now about some aspects which I believe round off in creating a great short film. So to start off with, I do believe the dialogue needs to be interesting, creative, original. I believe the dialogue is one of the main keys to the success in the short film, especially with films such as of the experimental genre, because you never really know how they're going to turn out because they're obviously experimental. So I do believe the dialogue has to be really strong for that. And dialogue can also make up for a basic storyline, because basic storyline narrative structures can be really effective for a short film. It doesn't necessarily mean the film has to be so complicated. If you have great dialogue, that can cover up for the fact that the short film is actually just of a basic storyline. Voiceovers, you need really clever dialogue or great dialogue, because sometimes with voiceovers you don't always have visuals going with the voiceovers. So I do believe great dialogue allows the audience to, if there's no visuals being shown, it will bring in the audience. It will catch the audience's attention even more, because there's no visuals. You're not really able to see anything. So if there's great dialogue, the audience can picture what's going on in their head. But usually with voiceovers, there usually is dialogue to fit with the visuals going on the screen. So great dialogue, maybe with like play on words and stuff, would be great. And it has to be really strong. Also, if it is a basic narrative structure film that is, typically linear, the dialogue can also help detract from the fact that it is a basic narrative structure. The dialogue can make the film itself really creative and seem really original just through the dialogue, even though it could be a basic narrative structure such as a man and woman meet and they fall in love. That would be a very basic narrative structure. It could be that, but the dialogue could easily make up for the fact that it is so basic. In contrasting to that, it also does help with non-linear films. It can help make sense of non-linear films, because obviously they're going back and forth in time, so it does help in that way as well, the dialogue, because it does drive the narrative forward. Another key aspect I do believe in creating a short film is the narrative. The narrative drives the characters forward. We see the characters' personalities develop or change as the film goes on, no matter if the film is linear or a non-linear structure. Non-linear narrative structures help us to see what the characters would have been like in the past and compare them and see how they have developed to how they are now in the present day. A strong narrative can be really basic but really effective at the same time. Sometimes I find if it's too complicated in a short film, it can detract away from the characters' individual personalities, and it can also allow the audience to switch off. On the other hand, you don't want to make the film's narrative too boring or too plain, especially if, as I said before, your dialogue isn't that strong. So you have to have that nice kind of balance with the narrative structure. Another key aspect to creating a great short film, I believe, is the locations. The location can sometimes depend on the style of the film, of the genre of the film, and where the film is based. If it's, say for example, if it's based in or set in Hawaii, you would expect to see palm trees, beaches, and anything that you'd really associate or think of when you think of Hawaii. But sometimes films can cheat. For example, if it's kind of hard to film the location, obviously if you're doing like a sci-fi film in space, it's obviously you can't really film in space. So for example, Star Wars, a lot of that was filmed in England. Even though it is an American film, a lot of all the space stuff was filmed in England, because all the outside shots were mainly filmed on locations such as deserts and stuff. But for all like the spaceships and stuff, it was filmed in England. Sometimes this can depend on the locations, can depend on the budgeting of the film company and how much the film company is willing to spend on commuting actors to the locations and commuting other crew members to the locations. And it also depends on, what's easiest for the studio and which way is the best way to save money as well. The locations kind of coincide with the narrative as well, and as I said before, they don't necessarily have to be filmed at the exact location that the narrative structure is set in. Just as long as it kind of looks believable and looks like the location, you can get away with it as well. Especially with short film independent companies, they may not always have the money to spend on hiring the locations, or cover travel expenses for the crew members and the actors. So sometimes you can cheat it with locations. Say if you need it to be filmed in like Brazil, you might not necessarily film it in Brazil. You may film it somewhere like, I don't know, Spain, wherever you live. If you live in Spain or somewhere, and somewhere that you can get away with that may look like Brazil or something. So I think just as long as it looks like the location and it's believable that it looks like the location with the weather and everything. And sometimes colour grading, if you use great colour grading in short films, you can get away with, if it's cloudy outside, with great colour, and you need it to look like it's hot weather, with great colour grading you can make it look like, with using like yellows and, you know, bright colours, you can make it look sunnier than it actually is. So sometimes sometimes colour grading and editing, and the editing of the film can help with the location as well, and, you know, the weather that you would expect that location to have. The fourth key aspect to creating a great short film is also character development. Characters need to develop with the narrative structure, as it can be very boring sometimes for the audience, and sometimes the audience can switch off if some characters tend to stay at the same level. And I do believe it is nice to have that contrast of, you know, you see some characters really develop and then some maybe stay the same, and it's great, it is alright to have that contrast. But if all the characters tend to remain the same, it could get quite boring, because characters also tend to drive the narrative structure forward. Developing characters can also add more depth and excitement to the film's narrative structure. They don't just make, as I said before, they don't just make the film run flat. It's nice to see characters turn from, you know, bad to maybe good, and it's also interesting to see a development maybe from, you know, being good to turning bad. And sometimes we tend to see, you know, like some of the dramatis persona characters grow in confidence maybe and become more heroic, or, as I said before, sometimes we see some characters go from good to bad and they transform into villains, and that leads on to it probably not necessarily meaning that the principal protagonist character has developed as a person, but sometimes the more co-star characters, like the second main characters, develop more than the principal protagonist. Like, for example, in some superhero films, you may get a guy who was good and then he's turned bad, and he's turned bad suddenly dramatically, so he's had a massive character development, and he may have developed more as a character than perhaps the more heroic character who's always been a hero. So character development doesn't always necessarily mean that it is the principal protagonist character who develops the most. And also, developing as a character could also mean just developing in age. You know, some characters grow old. Some characters, especially if the film moves on quite quickly in a linear structure, you see the characters growing older and they become elderly or something, and then they completely change, because obviously when you get older, you become more mature, perhaps more sophisticated. So it's not just developing in like, you know, suddenly turning from good to bad. It can also be developing in, as we all do in everyday life, we all develop as people, so it could just be developing in age. And one of the final key elements I'm going to be talking to you about is themes in a short film. Some short films, themes are more defined than others, they're more noticeable, but this doesn't really necessarily mean that just because their themes are more noticeable doesn't mean that it doesn't make the film any less intriguing than a film that has more noticeable themes. Film genres, some film genres, such as, you know, sci-fi for example, are expected to have more noticeable typical stereotypical themes than other genres. For example, as I said before, with a sci-fi film, they tend to have spaceships, planets and aliens, and these are themes that you would expect to see throughout most sci-fi films. Whereas films such as, films that are based on true life events, that are kind of like documentary films, these don't really have typical themes in them because they're based on a true life story. It could be about anything, so it's a bit more what it could be about can vary. It varies a bit more, so they don't really have stereotypical themes in them. As I said before, the themes in the films aren't always that noticeable, and it does usually depend on the genre of the film as well. An effective use of cinematography can cover up for basic characters and a very basic narrative structure. To enhance cinematography, SFX sound effects are usually used, or great CGI can be used to make it visually better, and it can make a basic narrative structure seem more intriguing, and it can give it more depth as well, or even a complex narrative structure. If you have great use of cinematography, it can also make it more visually better as well. Colour grading can also coincide with cinematography. It can help in suiting the day or the period of the film, the setting of the film. It can also, as I've said previously, it can go with the location of the film as well. Say if the location is set in a more sunny place like Hawaii or America, where it's a bit more hot or sunny, and you have to end up filming it somewhere like England or something in a studio. Great use of colour gradings, like you'd use bright colours as well to help with in bettering it and making it more believable as well. So I'd say like colour grading coincides with the cinematography, and as I've said, to suit the setting and location and the period and the narrative structure of the film. Using various angles and speeds of the shots can make the narrative structure more interesting and add more depth visually. So using different kinds of angles, you have like high angles, low angles, neutral shots, bird's eye views, and you also have like your panning shots, your dolly shots, your crabbing shots, and these can also work with using different speeds as well. Like for some films you could have like time lapse, which they use in some action films to slow down action, or they could speed up the cinematography that has been shot, and that later comes with the editing of the film. Sometimes it depends on the genre and the tempo of the film. If the short film has a specific tempo to it, like it's quite fast paced, then you might only use like specific shots. Like you might only tend to use quite a lot of neutral shots if it's going fast, so it doesn't add so much motion to the film. Some films are made to use one kind of shot as well, and especially with old films, they tend to do it in longer takes. This is more basic, but if it's well done, it can look very effective, and it can help the audience be more drawn into the dialogue if you want them to, and be more drawn into the character's development and the narrative structure of the film, rather than just thinking it looks visually effective. Although some films that do look visually effective through the cinematography and through the editing can also do sometimes have basic narrative structures, and this does make up for the fact that they do have a basic narrative structure, because it does look visually better, and so it detracts from that their characters probably aren't as in depth as some other films that probably use more basic cinematography.